Hmm.
Thank the maker. Good morning and welcome to Thank the Maker. This is KCL's only premier creativity show. We're here with you at the top of Bush House Southeast in the heart of London. Coming to you live from King's College London, typically live. We are living in the life and times of the coronavirus, which is really strange. But in light of that, we're going to do a little bit of social distancing ourselves today. This is my first ever virtual remote interview on the show, and I'm super excited to get it going. Today we have a special guest, Jared Adamo. He is a Brisbane-based camera operator, video producer, creative, tabletop aficionado. You name it, he is it. And that's kind of what we like from our creatives on the show. So yeah, I'll be talking with him over the course of the next hour. So stick with us and sit back. We'll be right back with you in just a second. Awesome. Yeah, so welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on. What time is it in Brisbane right now?
It's about 8:30 p.m. at the moment. So
8:30 p.m. Okay, so it's
yeah.
morning here, it's night there. Awesome. How's your day been? Let's just start there.
Yeah, it's been good. I have been running around. It's I work from home as a video producer, so it's a digital cloud-based studio that I work for.
Awesome.
But I have spent most of my day driving around getting hard drives of footage because the internet is now suffering under the new loads of people having to work from home. And I've been out and about trying to make sure all of my video editors have the footage that they need. So it's been a kind of a crazy day driving around Brisbane.
Yeah, that sounds like it. That's really interesting. So there's load problems in like across Australia right now, or is it just located where you are?
Yeah. Anybody who wants to look at how low populations do high-end internet. Australia's a special case study in that front. A couple of years ago, they got the NBN going, which is the National Broadband Network, and there's all this politics around it. And yeah, it's not holding up well. And as people are being quarantined and they're trying to encourage people to work from home, it's kind of suffering, and more remote places are suffering more. But we've already seen some of that because we do a lot of footage transfer from shooters and from different video projects. And yeah, it's been tricky because we're used to it running quite well, actually. And yeah, so it's been a fun challenge.
Interesting. So yeah, let's start with you. You said you would describe your position as a video producer.
Yeah, I also go by project manager as well because it's one of those things that in the video aspect of my job, it's all under the producer title, but then I also do a lot of like web-based and a lot of the 3D animation, virtual reality stuff, which all technically goes under project management. So I don't know. I try and sit across the entertainment industry a little bit in the producer role if I can keep the title.
Right.
You know,
That makes sense. So how did you get your start in that? Because it seems like quite a variety of skills that you're employing there, because you're not just making video, you're project managing, etc. What kind of career path led you to that?
I kind of looped out and around. I knew I wanted to do video pretty early on after kind of coming out of a university. I did graphic design and multimedia in uni. And then by the way, just real quickly, if I lapse into Australian slang every once in a while, it's very robust language slang over here, and the colloquialisms are mind-boggling. So I apologize if I say anything that sounds really bizarre or confusing. Yeah, so I wanted to get into video shortly out of university because I just didn't have the chops to make it in, text layout and print media and logo design, that type of stuff. But I scored really well on all my video classes and animation and image editing and stuff. So so then I went off and worked on cruise ships, and I worked for television, and I got over here to Australia, and the Australian system didn't wasn't very impressed with any of my achievements overseas, so I had to start back at the bottom. And I ended up like selling laptops and moving into the audiovisual industry, doing install work. And that's where I actually ended up getting kind of shoved against my will into doing project management because I was organized. I could use a computer and clearly lay out schedules and budgets and all that type of thing. And yeah, I just ended up becoming a project manager. And then I was able to leverage that forward into getting back into video production, kind of chasing down that producer role, which I hadn't really anticipated that that was a career ladder that could be climbed that way to kind of swing out and around. But it actually worked really, really well and gave me a lot of perspective on different aspects of the industry that I never would have had before. So I'm
Yeah,
pretty
wow,
grateful for
that's
that
super interesting,
opportunity.
and something you don't hear a lot, especially in kind of media circles. I feel like most of the discourse I hear is, you start as a runner and you work your way up, and there's not really any way
Yeah.
around that.
Yeah, I find a lot of times it's targets of opportunity that really allow your career to move forward. It's who you talk to and little projects, things that happen, who you had coffee with, and so to some degree that vertical stuff is actually a little bit outdated these days. It's like, and I'm not trying to pick on anyone, but starting in the mailroom to then become the CEO doesn't work. You have to move diagonally through different vertical sort of industries, which is really, I don't know, it's a whole lot scarier if you ask me, because you just never know if you're on an upswing or a downswing,
Right. Yeah, no, I totally get that. And like that's kind of been my driving philosophy in trying to form my own career, is that it's less and less about yeah, kind of this vertical progression, sticking with that one company, and more about transferable skills. What can you take from one place to the next that'll make you kind of stand out as a candidate? But on the inverse,
Yeah.
it's kind of scary because like I show people my resume nowadays, and they're like, "What is the through line here?" And
Yeah, total chaos.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
it's weird finding that and like figuring out that narrative, because you do really have to figure out like, okay, well, this is the progression, and it felt pretty natural.
Well, and one of the things that's interesting to me is that it's not. I don't see a career anymore, especially in the creative industry, as being an individualistic thing. There's so many people who advance their careers alongside their peers and even their competitors at times, and they actually bounce off of each other. And so, to some degree, that project based approach where you have a crew or people that you work with, or and if you go back and watch some of the old Walt Disney documentaries and stuff like that, like he would pull people out of weird tangential
So funny you say that. I literally just finished
Yeah.
watching the Imagineering story.
Imagineers. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Well, it's like he didn't care if the person had the credentials. What he cared is whether they thought properly to solve the problem he needed
Right.
solved.
Yeah. Yeah. He took like
That's
animators and
that's
put them on engineering roles. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And engineers that build one thing, and he'd go, "Well, you built that over there. You surely can build this over here." And that to me is the core essence of creativity and that sort of collaborative approach to everything that I really enjoy, from producing through to tabletop gaming, is that everybody has a slightly different perspective, and if they all put their pieces on the table, you can build something cool out of it.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so actually, let me start here. Normally, what I do is I start with the career and progress to the art. But I'm already curious because we're already kind of touching on it. Creativity, how does that defined for you? Like if you're approaching a project and you're like, I want to be really creative, what steps do you take to achieve that? I mean, you've already kind of spoken to the fact that you want like kind of a lot of outside, I don't know if you'd call it intervention, but like non-traditional, diverse things and inputs.
Well,
But like, how do you specifically approach creativity and think about it?
I kind of have a rather boring view of, like, it's not a very popular view of creativity, and the point that I tend to hook into, and at least I've seen this true in my own career path, my own life, is that creativity is merely solving problems, and it's solving problems in respect to the various different deliverables or outcomes that you kind of need to satisfy, right? If you look at George Lucas's first, Star Wars, low budget, limited time frame, nobody believed or understood what he was doing, and yet we got Star Wars out the other end, largely because, well, he was solving not just him but his team and his editor and there's a big story there, but ultimately it was like we had to solve this problem and we had shoestring and gum and tape and some Christmas lights. Okay, we got to make it work, and so to some degree I try not to overly mystify the creative process. I try to figure out what my goals are, where I need to get to with something, and then I try to solve it in the way that kind of satisfies all of that. And I'm from a real humble standpoint, bringing in various viewpoints. As long as those people, I think, as long as those people are respectful of the outcomes that need to be achieved, hear them out. See what different people can add to the mix. The problem becomes obviously when people don't have the same value outcomes as you do, and they start taking off in different directions. But if they share the same outcome, yeah, man, like it's a collaborative. It's heady too, because everyone shares the victory too. They shoulder the burdens together and they share the victory. So creativity to me is merely, solving that problem and figuring out what it is that where you need to get to, and trying to get there. And you can take some pretty crazy routes to get there at times, and it's like, well, this just may work, and that's where the creativity really shows itself.
Interesting that you say all that, because from one corner, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're coming at it from a problem solving perspective, which I think is totally valid. I think, when people are put into like tricky problems and challenges, that's where a lot of creativity emerges. And then on the other hand, you're kind of approaching it with this like value alignment kind of sentiment, this gelling, this integrating, to use business talk, synergizing, whatever. And I totally agree. And it's interesting that you brought up George Lucas too, because I think a lot of people, especially within the Star Wars fandom, and for anybody that listens to this show, everybody, I mean, I'm a Star Wars fan. George Lucas,
I wasn't aware.
A little bit, just a bit. I'm just, I don't know how many scenes.
That's only how we met, but yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, people talk about George Lucas in the sense of like the original trilogy, which is kind of heralded as like a cinematic triumph. He was surrounded by a bunch of people that kind of challenged and edited his ideas and kind of formed that into what became Star Wars. And then on the inverse, a lot of people point to the prequels as like, this is one man with a vision, but maybe not surrounded so much by people that are like checking him or adding that editorial function or coming in with their diversive ideas. So it's interesting kind of, and that, of course, some people love the prequels, some people love the original trilogy, but it is kind of interesting to see that play out on like a big budget scale.
Well, and even if you wanted to step away, I actually think that's true of almost all genius level creatives, if not all of humanity. I mean, if you look at, and look, to be honest with you, there's a lot of criticism based on its accuracy and everything else, but Bohemian Rhapsody, the movie that just came out about Queen, that's the point of the movie, is that anybody who's that intense and that out there actually kind of needs the reality check of some other people that aren't out there that far to just keep them referenced and keep them kind of grounded. And I actually really like that, because I think to some degree we have this real narcissistic, self-indulgent view of or we can fall into it through the Instagram culture and stuff like that, of these lone wolf creatives out there just making amazing, cool stuff, and they're completely, shackle free of all of the rest of us mortals, of what we have to face on a day-to-day basis. And yet, if you kind of dig into their process, they're bigger teams, they're bigger groups, they all have dark days, they have to kind of circle back to familiar, and it's like, oh, okay, well, this is the human process, and this is creativity, and this is us forging forward into chaos and creating order, and this is how we have to do it. Every once in a while, you have to drift back to order before you can deal with the chaos properly. So, anyways, I say don't get overly mystic about all of this stuff, but I can.
And here we are. No, it's true. That's why I started doing this show, because I took a class last term that was basically, it was called Contextualizing Creativity, and all it was just theorizing what creativity was, how to facilitate it, is it actually a thing or is it not a thing? Is the myth of the genius real? all these questions, all this stuff that's popped up in this conversation over the last 5 minutes. We've done like an entire lecture on
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Well, and I'm probably coming at it from a very layman's term, sort of
No, not at all.
very,
That
ignorant
it's
sort of. I took a semiotics class and I came over to Australia and I was doing a communication degree when I was over here, and I took semiotics, which is just amazing, mind blowing. And I'm not a postmodernist, but it was really interesting to dig into that and kind of go, well, to be successfully creative, you have to use recognizable parts, but you can have completely new patterns to those parts. So, Princess Leia is a princess. We know what princesses are, right? If you're coming into this not knowing what a princess is, she's not going to make as much sense. Space wizards, laser swords, the whole thing. They were all
so funny that
my
you're talking about
favorite,
this. Yeah.
my favorite scene, and it's probably my favorite because it was my dad's favorite. But the Mos Eisley Cantina scene with all the aliens, right? Why was that so powerful? Well, up until that point in history, aliens were on bridges of starships, or there was a million of them, or whatever, and the idea that they could all stand around and enjoy, some Jack and Coke, like at the
Right.
local watering hole, just hadn't been done before. But it was a recognizable part or recognizable elements that were combined together in a new pattern that everyone went, oh crap, that's cool, And so yeah, I don't know. That to me that's the genius. Is just, hey, look how this fits together differently than normal.
Totally, I totally agree. Again, going back to that Imagineering documentary, which I recommend you watch. It's like just came out on Disney Plus. One of the key things they talk about in their coaster design and their ride design is you've got to have an emotional in for the audience, and it's exactly what you're talking about. You've got to be able to relate to at least one thing, and that's. I was watching an interview with Mark Hamill last night about why Luke Skywalker is so powerful and popular, and it's because he's not a smuggler rogue that's like cool but you really can't relate to, and he's not a princess because nobody really comes from royalty. He's a farm boy. He's
a
somebody.
nerd.
Yeah, he's a nerd. He's dreaming of bigger adventures like all of us are, and you just gravitate
absolutely.
towards that. Yeah, and the Cantina reference, that's so true. You before this, it was all 2001: A Space Odyssey. Aliens are basically monoliths on the moon. No, this had them like in a bar drinking. Yeah,
Or you have some guy in a giant fursuit outfit in Lost in Space, black. I was watching some old classic sci-fi the other day, and it really is amazing to see how far we've come, but how some of this stuff is, it's so ingrained in our pop culture now. It's just incredible. But anyways, that's not necessarily in line with the story, but I guess to some extent, my efforts as a creative on that front have been to try to just keep a real humble, open mind about, what elements I'm working with, what patterns I have, or what patterns exist that may not be helpful in us at actually achieving the problems or achieving the outcomes to solve the problems, and being open to bit of some weird mixes. I think the weird stuff is where the creativity really exists. So
yeah. Getting back to you, let's talk a bit about like your projects and like what you're outputting as a maker. That's the name of the show. What's been the proudest project you've kind of worked on that you've been most pleased with yourself?
Well, that's a tough topic because I don't know.
NDAs.
I imagine. No. I imagine all the other creators out there are making stuff constantly, and I'm the only one who struggles to actually get stuff out the door on a regular basis.
No. Let's go back in the conversation. We were just talking about Instagram and people having their dark days. That's not true at all.
Yeah, I know. But look, honestly, probably my proudest, and it's nothing real major, but probably one of my proudest non-professional pieces was a short film called Breakdown that I wrote and produced, and then throughout the casting process we had a number of problems trying to find a male lead that could break down, ironically, on camera. And so I ended up acting in it as well, and that was probably one of the most eye-opening, humbling experiences for me to really appreciate or get a greater appreciation of what actors have to do in terms of putting it out there on camera. Because I had one little scene where I was supposed to be upset, and it was intense. It was, and I'll let viewers be the judge of how well I did. But even in my um, even in my untrained attempts at acting out this emotionally intense scene, I was probably 2-3 days of echoes emotionally afterwards because of how it affected me. And I've spoken to professional actors afterwards and asked them if that's common, and their response is generally, "Oh yeah, that's normal. Yeah, yep, yeah. You have a big crying scene or some big loud screaming match or whatever in a film, and you go away and you have all this weird psychological driftwood that you got to kind of collect afterwards.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's
yeah,
super cool.
Breakdown was fun. It made it into festival, and was screened down the Gold Coast, which is about an hour south of where I live. And they did a big. Oh, well, it wasn't huge, but they did a film festival down there that we got into. So it's pretty pumped to be
amazing.
part of that.
Yeah, I feel like I've heard like pretty consistently from like directors and producers with experience that like one of the best things you can do if you want to be directing is to take an acting class or to give it an attempt, because then you kind of you do understand what they're going through, and you can communicate that so much better. And like film and video production is such a technical industry, but really what you're outputting is heart and story and narratives and like the fuzzy stuff. So it's this weird dichotomy where like most people working on set are, ones and zeros, but then you've got your actors, which it's like the grayest profession there is. So that's super
subjective.
It's cool.
Well, and it's also tricky as well, because I think, and in much respect to the acting community, because it's so vast and diverse. You could have a director take acting classes and get a better perspective on things, and I'm all for that, and I've done some of that as well, which was not only really insightful but just a lot of fun too. I strongly recommend it. But you'll learn how you take direction out of that, which helps, of course. But I've worked with a number of different actors, and well, here's an example. One of the things that I like to do is I like to. Are you familiar with Myers-Briggs personality test?
Yeah. What's yours?
I'm an INFJ. Which
okay,
is
I'm an INFP. Very nice.
Yeah. Well, I'm friends with a lot of INFPs actually. But one of the things that's interesting is that I use some personality tests on when I'm crewing for a shoot or something like that, because it can tell me what mode and what avenue conflict should be engaged with this person, and some people like stuff super direct, and some people like it to be very, very softballed, and I don't have any disrespect for anybody who prefers one over the other, but in the creative process, it's really kind of like, well, what engages you? What actually causes you to feel on set engaged with the project, and how am I going to get that translated through into whatever your discipline is, and especially actors. That's why people have to go to such effort to look after actors, is because they're the thing that the audience ultimately has to emotionally engage with, and everything else is the machine by which that happens. But if the actor can't or doesn't bring it, then the audience is, gonna. And you can edit out an actor. You can do all sorts of weird different things like that. But ultimately, it's the actor having to kind of be the engine room for that. So
totally. And that's like another common theme I've heard. I went to some talk and it was like a low budget filmmaking talk, and it was like, what you want to invest in as a low budget filmmaker are the things that make the most difference. And honestly, it's acting. A beautifully filmed, polished film without good acting it's not a good film. But like a grainy Blair Witch Project with good acting is a good, enjoyable film. And of course, we're talking about genres and other things here. Did you have a comment?
Well, but I honestly, I was talking to someone the other day about this, and I was talking about the fact that the big climactic scenes in movies where things are blowing up and things are happening, and all of the sensational special effects and all of the things that are kind of going on, the spectacle of film, those those big high budget shots mean something when you have low budget shots of people to camera or whatever, kind of in a room talking, or those more intimate moments actually connecting, and it actually works. So the big one for me, and I may lose some members of your audience who have good taste in film, but I enjoy the Marvel films, and to me the big climactic fights in the end, and I won't, no spoilers for anybody who's however many years on how we are, but that fight wouldn't mean anything, and sometimes it doesn't mean anything to anyone anyways, but it wouldn't mean anything to even the most diehard fan if they hadn't actually gone through the 15 plus years of legwork to set up some of these characters and some of this narrative. So yeah, to me it's those low budget shots with the one guy sitting on the couch talking to his friend, or the real intense slow track into the guy as he's having his mental breakdown or whatever. Those are the things that kind of sell the big pageantry shots later
Totally.
on.
Yeah. No, that it totally makes sense. And we talk about this a lot in improv as well. This idea, and this is, I think, true of most comedy, is you need a straight man. And so I kind of see what you're telling me is kind of the straight man of dramatic action. You need something that's totally grounded to kind of contrast the big mystical stuff. So if we're, just to take it back to improv, if we're doing a crazy off the wall scene where people come out and they're playing characterized versions of the humps on camels' backs or something weird like that, geez. You've got to have a normal guy that walks in and is like, what the fuck? Or else it's just like this meaningless goo floating in the universe. Yeah. You've got to add that contrast. Yeah. And
it's the control, like in a scientific experiment, right? You gotta have that control base, otherwise you can't tell. And look, to be perfectly honest, that actually goes back to your creativity thing, because when people are shown something new and it's completely out of context, they don't know what to do with it. And we see this sadly with a lot of really great works that are way ahead of their time, and then the culture and the society catch up to the work, and then suddenly it becomes profound, but the artist has been dead forever. And it's like, well, why didn't we appreciate this at the time? Well, we didn't understand it, right? Yeah. This guy was way off the reservation. We had to kind of catch up and get, once we had reference for where this guy was actually, coming into play, or girl, not trying to be gender specific there, but, like wherever this artist was established, was so far off of where the rest of us were that it took us time to actually get there. And that's really kind of impressive, but also kind of sad, because you're like, man, they must have felt so isolated, in their creativity.
Yeah, that's interesting. Anyways. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of it from like a historical perspective. Yeah, totally. It probably will help us like moving forward as we venture out into the stars and find new civilizations.
But it's also a warning to creatives to have a look at, and I take a somewhat less I take a somewhat more practical approach to creativity, because I do it as a profession and stuff, is that I have to make sure that it makes sense to my audience. And is my audience properly grounded in the information that I need them to know? For instance, so professionally we make a lot of videos and 3D animations that show planned infrastructure works and roadways and things like that. It's real super exciting stuff. You're going to burst into tears when you watch it, right? But the truth is that almost all of those animations start with a wide shot to show known landmarks to the communities and stuff that will be affected by the project, to go, here's where it's at. This is where Sydney is, or this is where Brisbane is. And then as we punch into the road, we try to make sure that people feel comfortably aware of where they're at. It's not the most creative solution, but we have to do it so that people aren't just staring at a stretch of road or a bit of, railway tunnel or something like that in the middle of nowhere and going, okay, cool, it's a railway tunnel. It brings them into the scene.
So it goes back to the cantina scene. You gotta have an entry point. Some sort of reference.
Otherwise, and the truth is that who of us hasn't seen at least seen a bar shot of in an old western or something like that, to kind of go, oh, hey, look, they're aliens. It's helped me a lot as a creative to kind of go, does this make sense to my audience, and am I grounding it in something they're going to recognize before I kind of throw it out there? So
Yeah, and I love identifying like questions like that to ask yourself throughout the creative process, because like when you start with a blank canvas, kind of putting in those constraints on yourself can help narrow it down. So I'm gonna add that one to my repertoire of like reviewing and editing my work.
I'm glad I can contribute.
Yeah, you had another good one too. I was asking you for some editing assistance, and it was edit for attention, I think is what it was.
Yeah, edit for the eye. Yep.
Yeah. Phenomenal stuff. Anyways, let's talk a little bit more about this after the break. I also want to dive into tabletop and how we met, and kind of bring creativity not only into a professional context, but in a hobby context as well.
Yep.
But for right now, we're going to take a break. I ask all of my guests to bring a song on to use as kind of the break song, because it's kind of a fun opportunity to put some music on the air. What song do you have for me today, and why?
I would probably go with Loyal by Odessa.
Okay.
The reason why would be because this song was like the backing track to a really cool opportunity. I went down to Coffs Harbor and was filming for a video that I was producing, and it was kind of that hipster dream of traveling around and filming and shooting and editing and all of that stuff. So yeah, and this song was sort of the backing track for all that, which was quite fun.
Awesome. Well, let's give it a listen here, and we'll be right back at the end of the song. Yeah, so Jared, that was an intense song. Let's talk some more about that. What kind of music do you listen to, and does this fit into it?
I I I hate that question because I listen to all sorts of stuff. I feel like to some extent, um, music is a mirror, and so to some degree it's like whatever I'm kind of in the mood for I'll listen to, and sometimes use music to kind of steer. If I know I'm feeling a bit down, I'll listen to something that's a bit more upbeat, or if I'm feeling a bit too light and airy, I'll try and ground myself a little bit, just to try and establish some equilibrium. Loyal's intense. It's a good song. I like the fact that it's quite a mix of a lot of different traditional sort of sounds and stuff. It's got a bit of dubstep. It's got a bit of kind of the drum beat that's a bit more marching band sort of drum, and to a large degree, it's kind of a mess, and I don't know. I just like the fact that it echoes some of what we were talking about before about creativity being familiar pieces remixed into new patterns, and that's all music. That's all music is, it's just a lot of familiar pieces put together to new patterns. And so yeah, I don't know. I like the song. It's not something I listen to every day, but it's a good one. Gets the blood pumping.
So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your tabletop experience and kind of give the brief on how we met. Um, so Jared and I met on a relatively new service. It's not so new anymore, but it's called Discord, and it's how we're chatting today. But it's like online communities using voice and text. And just to kind of add another context, there's been this kind of resurgence in tabletop role playing and board games. And for those that won't have a reference point for that, that's kind of Dungeons and Dragons meets Settlers of Catan. That kind of cross intersection of games and hobbies is kind of where we found ourselves meeting in, wait for it, drum roll, a Star Wars kind of themed version of that, to put it in its most basic terms. Um, Now, Jared, you are what, or at least, I don't know, do you do much game mastering nowadays, GMing for the audience?
Oh, it's almost exclusively. I am a player in a particular session for a friend of mine. So shout out to Tim who runs a Star Wars game. But yeah, I run two live sessions, and I still do a little bit of digital when I get a chance.
Yeah,
Which is
and
which is
kind
good
of
fun.
where the world's headed right now in terms of like actually getting games going at the moment.
It is really kind of interesting the way you talk about the social distancing. If anyone had said that 6 months ago that social distancing was going to have to be a thing, and it was going to be quite, people would be sorting out their lives trying to figure out how they could kind of stay away from each other, we all would have been pretty confused, because it's all about. I think there's a lot of movement at the same time to bring down walls and to try and connect people and try and bring them back together. And what, oddly enough, if I could, kind of take off a bit of a tangent
No,
here,
please.
the board game community, I think, is a fantastic way to encourage sort of face-to-face stuff without maybe kind of violating some of the current rules of like group gatherings and things like that. Small groups sitting around a table playing a board game is still seems to be within the realm of what's allowed. And I spent a lot of time discussing and talking about this because as much as I play board games, I'm not as much of a board gamer as I am probably a tabletop role player. But it is really interesting how complete and total strangers can very quickly come together and have a nice, engaging, relaxed time around each other with a board game. And I think we kind of lost that, the commercialization, the over commercialization of board games and the standardization of them, and kind of it kind of became, you had the same sort of 5-6 boxes of whatever in the cupboard. It was Monopoly, Game of Life, Chutes and Ladders, or and to some extent it sucked the life out of it. And now with the resurgence of modern board game opportunities, the color's been added back in because you kind of never know what you're getting into, and So I don't know. I think to some extent, even with quarantines and everything that's going on now, and once that is sort of a thing of the past and we've moved on, I think that this may be a good time for people to rediscover how easy it is to sit around a table, have fun, do something interesting, and kind of reconnect, even though we're supposed to be socially isolated and distanced and stuff. So I don't know. I've got some hope. I've got some hope in the
Cool.
situation still.
I do find though a lot of people that I talk about board games with, there is this kind of trepidation when it comes to them because people, I don't know, people have this fear of rule books and like having to read and understand stuff. I don't know if I'd call it a fear. And then going back to tabletop role playing games, they're distinct, but they have similar circles of communities. People are also like, how like I'm not gonna sit around a table with people and put on a weird voice for an hour a week. But like I don't, you sit down and you do it, and it's what seems so strange and like what seems like there's such a high wall around it. It's really not. It's super accessible.
Well,
And man, I
And
wish I could get more people to do it.
well,
Yeah.
and one of the things about it that I think catches people by surprise is how they can contribute. We've spent decades consuming, right, with TV and even public sporting events and stuff like that, where we're the audience. We go along to the comedian and we listen to the jokes and stuff like that. But and there's nothing wrong with that type of entertainment. I'm not knocking any of that. But my point with tabletop role play particularly, and board games in general, but tabletop role play, is that you're able to add to the mix your input. You're not just sitting, and I've had players who have come over from computer games and other things, and computer games you have a bit more agency, but you're still, there's a lot of stuff that's locked down. You kind of have to play the game by the game's rules. It's like you can contribute whatever you want to bring to this is what you can bring, and if you have a good GM and a good group of players and what you're contributing is semi-reasonable, then you can create a pretty creative outcome. It's that recognizable patterns into, or recognizable elements into new patterns. It's like, wow, I actually helped make this story interesting. And that's the part that I think is the most heady for some people. They don't know that it's there, and then they come in and they try it, and their character slew the dragon, or they were the one that picked the lock, or they were the one that had the chat to the princess, or whatever. And they go away feeling like they actually accomplished something because they actually did. They contributed, and we're so used to consuming instead of actually creating that when we get a chance to do it, we're like, oh, that's so cool. I have a massive dopamine hit off of that. And people kind of, they love it. And, to the point where I've had people come back and complain that they're like, I can't get enough of this now. Like I go back and I play my single player game or whatever, on my computer, and it's good, but this feels like there's so much more potential for me to actually have agency. And so I don't know. That's one of those things that I get very excited for people to kind of
For sure.
experience.
Yeah.
And try out.
Whenever I try and pitch it to people, I try and kind of sell it as like it's less a game and more in regards to tabletop role playing, because we're kind of mixing two elements here, board games and tabletop role playing. But with tabletop role playing, it's collaborative storytelling is really all it is, and the whole.
Yeah.
I think this is what's going to be my tangent, but I think people have a lot of stigmas about it, and this isn't going into the whole D&D nerd stuff. It's more going into role playing video games like RPGs. So much of that was those elements of those games was carried over from really early tabletop role-playing games, and it's the stuff I don't really like about tabletop role-playing games, like leveling up, getting like skills, dungeons, turn-based combat. All of that, those are like that's not the key elements of a role-playing game to me. The key elements of a role-playing game are this collaborative storytelling narrative, and so I think there is this distance between video games that are labeled RPGs and actual tabletop RPGs that have sprung up and been developed.
Well, I was going to say, not to shoot myself in the foot, but I just did it in the in the previous sort of statement about princesses and dragons. Like, I guess to some degree that's one of the problems, and even even people like me who have a very strong faith and belief in all that games can be in their connective narrative sort of structures and what they can kind of add to people's lives and experiences. I'm pulling some pretty stock standard tropes out of the bag, so
Right.
and I think that's one of those things that pushes people away is, my dad used to talk about computer games in much the same, tone. I'll never forget him talking about running up and down halls shooting at people, and that was all we did in computer games, and to be honest with you, early days, you go back and watch Wolfenstein 3D or whatever, that's all you're actually doing, running up and down halls shooting at people, so, but that being said, I am coming across a ton more people who, when I tell them I like board games or I do tabletop RPGs or whatever, out of their mouth is immediately, oh, do you play D&D? Oh, is that thing that's on Stranger Things? Or, oh, I want to try that. I saw a video, or, and so there is a massive resurgence.
I totally
and
agree.
it is really kind of cool to see that
It's
happening.
great.
Yeah.
On one hand, I love it, but on the other hand, this is another tangent. So sick of the gravitation around D&D as a game. D&D is a great game. It is an old school game, but it is, man, in my opinion, and we're probably going on a little bit too deep here. It's so weighted down by some of the systems it keeps around. There are so much easier to approach games out there that are probably just way easier to get into.
Well, I just got given a starter set for D&D, and I've played it a few times, but the system I use is Fantasy Flight's Genesis or Star Wars Edge of the Empire systems, for those in your audience who are curious. But I'm actually reading through the starter book and just trying to get my head around it, and I'm trying to let go of preconceived notions about it, because the truth is that it does have such a pedigree and such a rich following, and there is such an intense loyalty. I try to gauge game systems based on the thing that comes out of the person's mouth after they ask me if I've played something. It's like, oh, have you played Pathfinder? I love the fact that you have to roll all of these dice, and then you have to really kind of stack all of your skills and stuff. And it to me, I'm like, okay, well, what I'm hearing is the next thing that someone follows up with is where they get their endorphin hit from playing the game. And Pathfinder, and I'm not going to bag it out, Pathfinder really, really appeals to the guys who like to stack up all the different numbers for their attacks and things like that to go really well. And to be honest with you, people like you and me and other people may not find that nearly as exciting as some really clever, funny social interaction that their character had with someone that they came across, So to some extent, the different rule sets, I think, can scare people off, but I'd rather people jumped in and tried D&D and got a taste for the game than steered away from it entirely.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I wish that there was a different entry point, because it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in the conversation. D&D is people's reference. It's what people are familiar with, and so it's like quite an easy entry point. But I think it's not built for that, because going to what you were saying with this whole what did people enjoy from it, when I talk to people that are new to tabletop role-playing games and they've played their first few games of D&D, the thing is always like, oh my god, like I got to play my character and voice him, and we did this crazy thing, and here's this crazy thing that happened. I'm like, that's amazing, that's cool. What you're gravitating towards is not really what D&D caters that well to. Like, there are systems that do it.
It's definitely not where they're from. You go back to the original Series 1 and stuff like that, and it was narratively very dry, but again, I think a lot of this comes back to, and I really encourage people to try this as a game format, because it does allow them to come up with their own contributions to the story, and it's not in a vacuum. You have people around the table playing with you. But I would also caution people and say, if you do come into a game and you don't feel like you're getting that opportunity, it might be the people that you're playing with.
For sure.
And no disrespect to anybody anywhere, but It's like a group of musicians trying to make a song. And, if you're a tuba player and you come in and everybody else is on bagpipes, it's going to be tough for you to find your place amongst them. So to a large extent, and I've got a couple of friends who have bounced around from different gaming groups and things, and talk about, oh, I just really couldn't find my feet in this particular story or with this particular rule set or whatever. And, well, kind of still keep looking, because the experience that you want is out there. It's just might be that you have to kind of find the people who gel with you, like you would in a friend group going camping or anything else. You got to find the people that you're going to get along with. So,
So yeah, let's talk about you some more. You consider yourself a GM, and just to kind of bring in again the terms here and make it a bit more accessible. A GM is a game master, and in your typical role playing game, kind of the precedence is you have your players and you have your game master, or in D&D they're called dungeon master. And basically, the game master is the director of the story. They kind of offer up pieces of narrative that the players then react to, and that's kind of how games work. The game master presents a situation. Let's say to make it not D&D related. Let's say you're a bunch of thieves trying to steal a diamond in your made up story from a bank. The game master could present the bank and what it looks like, and then say there's a guard, and then they ask the players, what do you do? How do you get past this situation? And that kind of game cycle of the game master offers up a situation and then the players respond is how most role-playing games work. It's kind of a give and take.
Well, I was just going to say, and the players attempt something, but then they have to roll a dice based on their skills to see whether or not their attempt is successful or not. So it keeps it from being contrived. When you're a kid playing in the backyard, make believe, it's just whoever yells the loudest, I guess. But for this as a somewhat more sophisticated narrative game format, there's a lot of rules around that, and it's in those rules, I think, that people can either get real scared away or kind of go, oh well, this isn't that tricky. I can add up the dice, or I can figure this out. I can read my character sheet, and now I know how to drive them around. So
right.
But yeah, I'm a GM, and I don't think that's not a particularly brag-worthy sort of title. I think anybody can kind of jump in and do it and then claim to be one. There are some other sort of subjective titles that I kind of throw around a little bit. I'd like to identify myself as a sandboxer,
Okay.
which means that I will present narrative elements and environments and non-player characters or the extras in the scenes, but the players get to choose the direction. So if they want to. If in your diamond heist scenario, if the players decide that they all want to turn themselves into the police and take up real estate investment on the other side of town, I'll allow that, and I will still play it out that direction. It sounds super boring to me, but ultimately, the point with a sandbox GM is that I have the environment and I have larger forces of narrative that are happening around the players, but I'm largely allowing them to choose the routes and the goals that they have kind of come to the table with that they want for their characters. So that means that I get to ultimately plan a lot less and have to improv a whole lot more. There's entire sessions where I've had scenarios written out of what things that I think are going to happen, and within about 2 minutes, we're in completely different train and headed off in a different direction, and I've got to completely improv everything out in front of everybody.
Yeah,
So,
I love that style too. My question for you, and this is something that I struggle with, and I think a lot of artists struggle with, but I think it's particularly evident in this kind of creative field, is you start with a blank canvas when you're making these games often. Or at least a lot of people choose to, as opposed to following along with a book. Where do you even begin? What let's approach it from a world building perspective. What stroke do you lay down first when you're trying to craft a story?
I try to think of something really horrible that's happening, that's in the middle of happening.
Uh-huh.
Some bad thing is going on, and Fantasy, I feel like fantasy tends to be a lot easier to think up bad stuff that's going on than Star Wars, even though Star Wars is one of my favorite sort of story universes to play in. But yeah, I just kind of go, okay, what's something terrible that's going to eventuate if the players do nothing, you know?
I see.
And to some extent, if you create that tidal surge of negative impact that's dooming a world that they have yet to really know or care about, the initial sessions that you play are about kind of getting them hooked into the world and understanding that it's in jeopardy, and that if they don't do something, it's all coming down. And that's fun for a GM to create something and then throw a rock at it.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. So,
So
if I'm understanding right, you kind of start with the call to action before even starting with like setting. Is that correct?
yeah, well, yes, and one of the reasons that I do that is because I think a lot of new players, and I tend to play with a lot of new players. I very rarely get the opportunity to play with seasoned role players, and I'm not entirely sure what I've done to anger the fates to that point where I don't get to do that. But so the thing that I find with new role players is that they tend to create characters that don't have a whole lot of quirky agency. They tend to create much more stable stasis sort of characters. So it really does become me kind of anticipating that they're going to come in as a fairly functional, everyone's parents are always dead. That's the first one. That's the trope, right? But other than that, they just kind of looking around, seeing what's going on in the world. So I've got to compensate for that to some degree in the narrative, and spur them into action.
So I have just a few questions left for you, probably just a couple, because we're running out of time here. In terms of like facilitating players as a GM, one of my kind of struggles in getting new players into it is there's always this wall of character creation, which it always seems so backwards to me. And I know there's preset characters that kind of circumvent this, but it's such a rule process. Like you've got to like go through your rule book, see what you have to do, yada yada, before you can even get to the game. Which a lot of people just want to get to the game. How do you tackle that, and how do you kind of like ease people into complicated systems when they really just want to play?
The truth is I don't actually make anybody read any of the rules until we're at the table.
Uh-huh.
And I know this is not traditionally how it's done, but the way that I do it is I keep it conversational, and I just ask people, as your character, what is it you think they want to do in being faced with this situation? And they tell me, and then I go, okay, well, look on your sheet, find your stealth roll, and now see the, and roll this, and okay, now, and I'll slow the narrative down, I'll slow the game down and teach somebody how to do it. But I try and start with, what do you want? Or what does your character want first? That way they have a motivation to learn it. If I just go, hey, this rule works in these situations, and this rule works in those situations, whatever, they're not going to have any context. So, and I've trained, I don't want to brag or anything, but I've trained a lot of players, and I'm trying to come up with a relatively close number. I would say modestly 50 some odd role players of and through online and in real life. And it really does come back down to, what do you want? And because when you want something, and this is creativity in general, when you want something, you're going to figure out how to get it. You're going to solve the problem. And that can be some pretty strange answers that come out of people's mouths when it's like, what does your character want in this situation? But it's the absolute core human narrative function is being in some place and wanting to be someplace else, or wanting something else. And so that's kind of how I teach the rules. That's how I kind of go at it, as a GM, is trying to keep them engaged with wanting something, and then that will teach them the rules, and it will also move the story forward. So, that's how I do it.
Well, I've just typed out here because we've had so many good advice bombs throughout this show.
I know, I'm just Gandalf
No,
over
it's
here.
it's
I'm
great.
sorry.
So if you want to be creative, this is Jared Adamo's guide to being creative. First, ask, what do you want? Second, edit for attention. And three, have a relatable entry point to ease people into what you're making. That's what I've gathered from today.
Yeah, that sounds much better than what I said.
No, it's what you said, just taken from across.
Just boiled down and said eloquently.
Well, anyways, thank you so much for coming on the show. I end every show asking for a recommendation from the creatives I talk to. And this can be anything. A lot of people kind of just gravitate to what I first suggest. So instead of suggesting even like a genre or an item, what would you like to recommend?
I would say, and this is going to be a bit cliched for anybody who is familiar with the D&D universe. I would say go on YouTube and watch Campaign 1 of Critical Role with Matthew Mercer as the GM, because it's pretty amazing and it's pretty exciting stuff and it's very accessible. So yeah, that's what I'd recommend. Campaign 1,
I would
Critical Role.
echo that. Yeah, it's great. It's basically the pitch for it. It's a bunch of voice actors that do like voice acting for like animation and all sorts of stuff. They sit around a table and they play D&D, but they voice act the entire thing. So it's like you're watching a radio show unfold, except they're playing it through the guise of this game. It's phenomenal.
It is excellent. And what's funny about Matthew, if I could say real quickly, is that I started off really intentionally disliking Matthew because he's the celebrity and it's D&D and he's good looking and he's cool and he's just everyone loves him and whatever. So I went into it with that like, nah, this guy's I don't like him. And then I've watched some and I just like, he's won me over. He's just one of the nicest people ever and he's a great GM and he really does care about people and the game and wider sort of stuff. So anyways, and I guess that's one of the other things that goes back to who you play with and how you engage with this stuff is that at the end of the day, these cool personalities and stuff, get them out, get it on the table, and get everyone shares, and you can have this really cool stuff kind of come out creatively when you collaborate that way. So
what a great place to start if you're interested in tabletop role playing is watch some professionals do it. Anyways, Jared, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and we should catch up and play some games at some point as well.
I look forward to it, Clay. It's been a huge honor. I appreciate it. I hope your listeners go well with the current situation out in the world, and I appreciate you having me on.
You stay safe yourself. This has been Thank the Maker. We're out. Enjoy your day.